Welcome to the neutral ground. Critical thinking is not something that is easily defined or taught. Trust me. Sometimes people say, you know it when you see it. However, my guest this week, author Jonathan Haber, has written a fantastic book entitled Critical Thinking, and it explores what it is, where it came from, and how we can continually hone this vitally important skill. As someone who is in the profession of teaching critical thinking, I definitely recommend this book, especially if you're interested in a little bit of history, how we came to critical thinking, and also in having a practical guide for how we can engage in more critical thinking. Now, we don't just discuss the book, we actually put it into practice. We engage in a bit of a discussion of the rhetorical back and forth that took place between CNN and Joe Rogan. Trust me, you're not going to want to miss this conversation. Now, before we dive into it, just a quick note. Please hit the subscribe and/or follow button on whichever platform you're currently listening to me on. And if you're on Apple or Spotify, please consider leaving a kind rating and/or comment as well. That will help get our message of civil discussion in front of more eyes. Now, without further ado, enjoy my conversation with Jonathan Haber. Jonathan, welcome to the Neutral Ground. How are you doing today?
Good. I'm good, Joseph. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Well, let's dive into the conversation. You dedicate your book, Critical Thinking, to mom and dad for teaching me to think. So how did they do that? And when did it actually hit you that that's what they were trying to do?
My parents are both academics. My father was an English professor. Like you, he taught at University of Lowell in Massachusetts for many years. My mother was a librarian at Radcliffe. And, I think we just took for granted we always had dinner together, and dinner would be full of conversations about things we were reading, things we were working on in school. And so I think without it being a sort of formal process, I just of understood thinking, discussing, argumentation would be was part of my life. I didn't have the vocabulary for it then, but, it continued into adulthood when, my parents were readers of material. In fact, my dad was probably one of the best editors I've ever seen. So he was a person who edited a great deal of this work. I should say it was sort of poignant when I made that dedication, because by the time the book was coming out, my dad was very ill and was dying. And I wanted to surprise him with that dedication, and MIT Press, the publisher of the book, very kindly sent me a early release copy that they had for marketing purposes. So I was able to kind of read him the dedication before he passed. So it was particularly poignant that this book was dedicated to both my parents, but especially to him.
Wow. Yeah, that was really nice of the press to give you that advanced copy.
Oh, the whole press mobilized. It was really a wonderful moment of we've got a professional relationship with people, and it's a fabulous press, a fabulous group of people to work with. But that really of cemented on top of all that what wonderful people they are. So I'm enormously and will forever be appreciative of that.
We hear so many times negative stories in the media and whatnot. It's just nice to hear that someone just did something, really kind. Well, I think you do a really good job of pushing back against what must have been quite an urge, right, to cement a definition for critical thinking. In fact, you spend quite a bit of time in the early parts of the book discussing how critical thinking is defined by others. I think this works to your favor, actually, because the reader leaves with a really firm grasp of what critical thinking is, but they aren't necessarily pinned down by just one viewpoint. Because as you point out in the book, critical thinking is somewhat broad in how we approach it. So rather than ask you a question like, how do you define critical thinking? I'm going to ask you instead, how do you think about critical thinking?
Well, I think, the definitional issue came up all the time. I mean, the fact that you're kind of not asking a question makes you unique. Because when I would tell people I'm writing a book on critical thinking, a lot of them were asking, oh, I hope you can come up with a definition because there's so many of them out there. And, and in fact, I did start by thinking, well, maybe not necessarily coming up with my own to add to the pile, but to distill and synthesize, which is sort of what I do. But as I kind of plowed through it, I realized, a lot of these definitional issues, a lot of debates about definition were getting in the way. There was a lot of conversations I've had over the years, even before starting this book, that we can't teach critical thinking until we know what it is. That's a very familiar line you get when you're sort of trying to convince people to work on critical thinking specifically as part of a curriculum, for example. So, you realize there is this debate over definitions. But then when I started digging into that debate, it's very typical of kind of academia. There is a discipline committed to critical thinking. It's a branch of philosophy. The critical thinking organization is part of the APA, American Philosophical Association. And, academics do what they do. They research and try to come up with angles, definitions. In some cases, there's commercial sort of need to own a definition, because if you're creating a test or a curriculum, you do need some kind of definitional construct to work with. So I understand those imperatives, but I realize they're just not necessary to move forward with a critical thinking project. As you cite an analogy, the field of biology has transformed significantly over the last several decades. It's moved from something that, when I was learning biology in high school, was almost like learning a language. But over time, it's become much more computational with an understanding of DNA and DNA sequencing. So the definition of biology is up for grabs, but we're not halting the teaching of this subject while we wait for these definitions to settle down. There's still a body of knowledge to teach and move forward. So my message was this, that the critical thinking project can move forward without, what people are really asking for when they ask for a definition is a definitional wording, some definitional words that we can all agree to. And you asked how I think about critical thinking. My approach was essentially genealogical. Where does the idea originate that there's a form of thinking distinct from knowledge and wisdom, unique enough to be called critical? And if you read the book, you'll see that's where I sort of started the exploration and ended up in a place where I think there is a consensus, even amongst all the definitions. We can agree with what critical thinking is enough to move forward with the critical thinking project.
What I really enjoyed here, whether you meant it or not, actually, is that the reader essentially practices critical thinking, through analysis, through synthesis, while they're reading about all of these different thinkers like Aristotle and Dewey. This prompts the reader to develop his or her own kind of language for maximizing comprehension of critical thinking. And that's very empowering to the individual, because it also prompts a creative process as well. That's something that I actually try to do with my students as well, is to get them to have ideas, take them in, and then give them language to be able to maximize that kind of comprehension. Now, something you wrote in the book also I wanted to ask you about here, and that is in the first chapter, you write about the distinction between philosophy and science did not exist in the ancient world. Now, I think there are some individuals like Angus Fletcher and maybe Jonathan Haidt. I think there are some people who are trying to meld philosophy and science together again a little bit here. But my question for you is, has that loss or the weakening of the connection between philosophy and science, has that impacted the way that we think critically today?
Well, I'd say, if you ask a philosopher, especially, they will indicate that philosophy is not just the sort of father of science, but the father of all disciplines. And you can certainly make the case that certain disciplines, science, psychology, grew out of a philosophical tradition. And it's not just ancient, right? Until, the sort of later part of the 19th century, people didn't call themselves scientists. They called themselves natural philosophers, right? So the connection is that you are making inquiries about the world, and some of those inquiries are about nature, science. Some of the inquiries about the human mind, psychology. Some of them are about the soul or religious matters, right? So I would say, the philosophical toolkit is utilized in all those fields, right? The discipline of philosophy will apply a set of tools, logic being first and foremost, but other sort of tools to an inquiry. And if you look at what scientists do, if you look at what scholars do in any field, they are in fact still using logic and argumentation to sort of point people towards a conclusion. So I would say, there are elements that I bring up in the book from philosophy that go back to Aristotle, logic, argumentation, persuasive communication, rhetoric, et cetera. Those do underpin all those fields, certainly when they are coming up with theories, testing them, communicating them to others. So I would say, this is sort of probably a kind of separate tangent, but I would say one of the reasons the debates we have between sort of science and religion, for example, are so empty and sort of both hostile and vacuous at the same time, as I often describe it as. It used to be, science, religion, and philosophy formed three legs of the stool, right? But nobody knows philosophy anymore. So we've kicked that leg out. And we wonder why the stool is still unstable. Philosophy provides a language for, if not resolving, at least for people of differing opinions to argue things out. And I think, in a way, my work and the work of other people, including yourself, to sort of bring critical thinking back into the discussion in all matters is to sort of stabilize our discussions. I think, why are we shouting at each other rather than trying to convince each other? Well, we don't know how to convince each other because we are not taught the sort of critical thinking tool set. And that's what I'm trying to bring back into education.
Well, I'll just take a moment here and expose, something from my own experience teaching here. Like you, I thought I'm going to bring in some philosophy into my class here because I want to engage the students in some higher level kind of critical engagement, critical thinking. And, I brought in people like Frederick Douglass, Plato, a little bit of Nietzsche as well. But to your credit, what you did quite well in the book here that I didn't do so well this past semester is that we had our discussions, and they were great discussions in a vacuum, essentially, because we modeled how do we engage higher level thinking while we were having those discussions. But the problem that I ran into is that we had our discussions and then we talked about what critical thinking entails. And my students, without me knowing at the time, my students ended up separating those two things out. So they looked at the discussions we had as simply interesting discussions, and then they were done. And then we moved on to critical thinking, and we did critical thinking, as opposed to thinking about how the two things synthesize together. So something that I took away from your book that I found to be quite useful as an educator was how we can use philosophy as a better means of organizing how we think about critical thinking, right? Because I can definitely tell that I would need to put those two things closer together in order for the students to understand that they work hand in hand.
Well, I think you also discovered something that critical thinking researchers have been studying for the last 30 years. There was a important paper written by Professor Enos in the 80s where he proposed there are three different ways to teach critical thinking skills. And you read about these in the book, but one can do what we're doing in higher ed and teach a critical thinking course, right? That's called the general approach. You can teach your own subject matter, be it English or philosophy or science or mathematics or whichever, and assume that, well-taught complex material students will be absorbing the critical thinking skills by osmosis, right? That's called the immersion approach. But there's a third approach, which is called the infusion approach, where you still teach critical thinking skills in the context of a discipline, be it English or science or what have you, but you explicitly bring out that you're teaching them critical thinking skills, right? So when you were teaching students or presenting them with Aristotle or Nietzsche or philosophers, you were using an immersion approach, which is typical, actually. I would say most education in the world is done through that immersion approach. But unless you sort of pull out the fact that Aristotle and Nietzsche are using logical arguments, they're using them in very sophisticated ways, and then explaining to people what a logical argument is, and therefore having to explain to them what is logic and what is an argument, right? That's the explicit means of teaching. And as it turns out, 30 years of research seems to confirm that this infusion approach, where you teach critical thinking in the context of other subject matter, not necessarily as its own standalone course, but in the context of English and science, et cetera, but that you do so explicitly, that's considered, research seems to indicate that is the best way to teach critical thinking skills. So I'd say, your challenge was the same challenge that people have when they're thinking, I'm a great science teacher, so therefore my students are becoming critical thinkers by learning chemistry from me. And then, 5 years down the road, they get a job, and 75% of employers say kids don't have these skills, right? They don't have the skills after high school, after college, after graduate school, so I think there's one of the reasons kind of 99% of professors say teaching my kids to be critical thinkers is one of their top 3 priorities, and 3/4 of employers say kids don't have these skills, is not lack of enthusiasm, right? The academy, whether, everybody from a kindergarten through graduate school professor, now wants kids to develop these skills and think they're already doing it, so that's the good news. They just don't happen to be using the best techniques to do so. And to sort of a lot of my work since publishing the book is trying to get academics to understand that with some small modifications to what they're already doing, that doesn't have to sacrifice the subjects they love and even the ways of teaching they love, but just sort of supplement them in very strategic ways, they can accomplish what they claim that they want to accomplish, which is develop critical thinking skills in their students at any age level.
Yeah, in my case, I definitely think that in the future, pulling the two ideas together, critical thinking and scaffolding critical thinking with the philosophy as well, I think that will definitely help in the future here to push them more together, as opposed to say, okay, let's learn this information of the philosophers and the great thinkers, and then let's try to use that to think about critical thinking. Putting them together at the same time would probably have a better effect in the students seeing those two things as not separate kind of parts of the semester, let's say.
Another method that research shows is extremely important for critical thinking is deliberate practice.
Yeah.
In a way, critical thinking, I would say, is much more similar to a sport or a musical instrument, mastering a sport or musical instrument, than it is your discipline, English, or any other business, because it's a relatively small set of skills, right? I could teach students, I have taught students the critical thinkers toolkit in a couple of days, right? It's not nearly as vast as the world of literature, biology, but to get really good at it, you have to sort of use it for years, right? That the rules of logic, let's say, informal logic, are very straightforward. You could start using them for what we call toy arguments, arguments that are designed to be broken down and analyzed as part of a logic exercise. But to get good at it, you have to apply it to increasingly sophisticated materials like newspaper editorials, political speeches, philosophical tracts, novels, fiction, nonfiction documents, et cetera. And that's just something that has to kind of that's a skill that develops through continuous and ongoing practice. So I would say, for your students, one way to get them to get it would be making, them develop their writing using argument or tools of argumentation rather than a traditional outline, right? And in a way, the outline is the enemy of logic because it doesn't necessarily arrange things as premises leading to conclusion, or at least doesn't identify them. Whereas if you ask students to map their papers logically before they write them, then they will sort of absorb, oh, actually, at the end of this, I'm writing a paragraph that contains an argument because it was planned that way. So that's one kind of thing you may want to try next time you want to kind of get students to sort of internalize this.
Okay, so let's model this for our audience then a little bit here as well. There's an example that you use in your book, and it's a good one, I think, for our use here. I'm going to read this because I want it to be as accurate as possible. The example is based on a study by Aaron and Roska from the work Academically Adrift, and it proposes a conclusion that students in higher education are showing no growth in critical thinking ability during their time in college. Now, in order to believe the argument there, right, and validate it, you have to accept the two main premises that come before it. Here's premise one. The collegiate learning assessment, which is an assessment tool, of course, accurately measures a student's critical thinking ability. So you have to engage that first assessment that this college learning assessment tool can accurately measure a student's critical thinking ability. Premise two, college students who took the collegiate learning assessment early and then later in their college years showed no significant growth in test scores. So you have to buy the second premise, which says that this tool did in fact show that the college students did not show significant growth. Now, the final conclusion then from these two premises is that college students show no growth in critical thinking ability during their time in college. Now, when you talk about this example in your book, you break down how we can judge the validity of this final conclusion based upon looking at these two premises. Can you walk us through that process of how you engage in this judgment or validation of the conclusion?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, the intro to the book kind of brought up the academically drift study because it was very prominent, many people were talking about it when it first came out because it certainly seemed to jibe with a sort of cultural sense that college was not preparing students for successful careers in life. And I think the notion that critical thinking is essential for a successful career in life was what attracted it to my attention, because in a way that's a premise to that argument as well. So I mentioned that early in the book, and then the argument you just read came after a section on whether critical thinking can be assessed, right? So of sections of the book, how can it be defined? Can it be defined? Can it be taught? And can it be assessed? And my answer is yes to all three, or certainly yes to the point where we can get moving on the critical thinking project, right? So in order to evaluate the academically drift hypothesis that critical thinking was not improving with students, you firstly have to understand what the authors are actually saying, right? You have to read the source material. You have to read academically drift. And if you do so, you will understand that they had a way of demonstrating that students were not developing critical thinking skills. It was not just an observation out of the blue, right? They had a measure to determine critical thinking skills. And as you mentioned, it was the CLA plus, which I talk about in that section on whether critical thinking skills can be assessed. And it's a very prominent assessment. It's probably considered, the best of critical thinking assessments out there. But it is an assessment. It's a commercial assessment. When you're dealing with any kind of professionally designed assessment, it's based on something called a construct, which is a definition, right? That like I said before, you don't need a definition of critical thinking to move forward with a broad general education product of critical thinking. But you do need a definition of critical thinking if you're going to measure it, right? You have to know what you're measuring it. And that definition, testing lingo, is called a construct, right? So now we have one of our premises, right? One of our premises is that there exists this test called the CLA, and they did a scientific experiment, right? They tested a group of students at one point in their career, and they tested the same students later, okay? And in that study, they found no growth in test scores, right? So from there, you kind of move into another, that's a critical thinking skill called background knowledge, right? You need to know what you're talking about before you can have an argument. You need to understand what the academically adrift thesis is really saying, and you have to understand something about testing of critical thinking skills, right? So I've just applied background knowledge. Then you have to sort of distill that into a logical argument, which is just what you just read. Right? The first premise of the argument is the CLA plus accurately measures critical thinking skills. The second premise is student test scores do not go up. And so therefore the conclusion is students do not improve their critical thinking skills, right? Now, we've just constructed an argument. We've used, I refer to generally as language skills. How do you take prose argument or implied arguments that you'd see in a book like Academically Drift and distill it down to a set of premises leading to conclusion, right? So that's a second. We use background knowledge. We've used our language skills to take complex material and distill it into a set of premises leading to a conclusion. Now we analyze it using the tools of logic. And I tend to think and write in terms of informal logic. There are other forms of logic you can use. There's diagrammatic reasoning, but informal logic is simple and easy to explain. And it basically, there's two tests you apply to it. One is a test for validity, okay? And the test for validity says, if you accept the premises as true, are you forced to accept the conclusion, okay? And in that argument that you read from the book, it in fact is valid, right? If you accept that the CLA plus accurately measures critical thinking skills and you accept that student skills didn't improve, then it's a conclusion, it's a valid conclusion that students think critical thinking skills do not improve, right? So there's your test for validity, okay? But there's a second test for argument strength, and that is the test of soundness, right? That you want to test for validity first, right? Because that will often tell you, if your argument is invalid, right? If you accept the premises and reject the conclusion, then it doesn't matter if the premises are true or not, right? So you always want to test for validity first, right? So, but now you can check for soundness, and the test for soundness is, can you reject one of the premises, either because it's false or it's something a reasonable person can doubt. Okay. And in this case, we have two premises. The second premise said student test scores did not improve over time, right? And in theory, we can reject that, right? We can dig into their data, we can question their methodology, you can question people's integrity, but I think it was pretty clear reading the book that they did a good job, and there's no reason to, think that scholars of their caliber cook the books. And especially since there's a much juicier target, which is the first premise, right? Because that's saying we have a measure of critical thinking skills, it's a CLA plus, and that we can make broad statements about general student critical thinking ability based on that test. And even the people who make the test don't make sweeping statements that this measures, critical thinking full stop, right? We all know critical thinking is complex. It does a very good job at measuring what it measures, okay? So if you agree that that constitutes critical thinking or is close enough or enough for us to use for purpose of this discussion, which is our students learning these skills properly, then, you would accept that premise, and then the argument is both valid and sound. But if for whatever reason you reject that premise, right, you think critical thinking is more broad than what the set of skills that can be measured with a CLA or any test, right? Or you think that sort of critical thinking encompasses other types of thinking, creativity and such, then you can reject that premise, and therefore the argument is unsound. And people can have honest disagreements and debate these things. I think what comes out of that argument is, certainly the academically adrift study shows that, the sort of systematic types of reasoning that are core critical thinking skills that are measured in a test like the CLA do not seem to be improving sufficiently over someone's college career, right? So, now you'll notice that the conclusion was not, and therefore higher education is a waste of time, right? In fact, you could point to conclusions drawn from the study that, for instance, professors should spend more time explicitly teaching critical thinking skills, right? They should utilize techniques that will do what they claim they want to do, which is to improve student critical thinking skills. So there's other kind of linked arguments that sort of draw from the study. And that was meant to just provide an example of how the complete critical thinkers toolkit can be used, not necessarily to resolve a controversial issue, there's no final answer, but to argue it out, and to argue it out thoughtfully, and hopefully in a way to persuade or create understanding versus closing off debate and sort of leading to kind of misunderstanding and mistrust.
Now, what I liked about the way you framed this discussion in the book is you talk about an option of altering the conclusion a little bit so that it becomes more precise. So, for example, you could say, based on the CLA assessment tool, students show no growth in critical thinking. And what's so important about that is that you can now validate those first two premises and say, okay, based on that one tool, not to say on a broad scale, in college, students show no growth in critical thinking. It just simply says, based on this tool's metrics, students show very little to no growth in their critical thinking ability. What's good about that is you can plug in then other assessment tools into the conclusion, and you can keep your premises, and then you can start thinking about or refining the overall question of how we can measure students' growth in their critical thinking. And as someone, if you're in higher education, you're always supposed to be having these kind of internal discussions and reflecting on where we are, where we want to be, and what are the tools that we're using to get to that point. So I actually really enjoy the framing of how you walked through the process to get to a more accurate conclusion there at the end.
Well, if people want to see examples of this sort of being applied, I've got a website called Logic Check that I created, logiccheck.net, that applies these tools to current events, the news of the day. The premise is it's meant to be, it's modeled on fact-checking sites, but the idea is that facts are premises to arguments, and you can have completely truthful facts that all check, they pass all the fact-checking tests, but they're leading to a false conclusion. Why? Because they're unvalid or unsound. They lack some of the qualities of a strong argument. So I'm part of my mission is trying to persuade the journalism field to embrace this concept of logic checking also, which is an interesting exercise in and of itself. But these tools can be applied. In fact, I'm writing something now about kind of recent editorials in the New York Times and the Atlantic that are kind of starting to, you could say, question or think more broadly about COVID policies, right? We're entering the second year, we're entering, both new unknowns like new strains, but also things we didn't know 2 years ago when other policies were put in place. And I find it very interesting because to a certain extent, you're seeing a convergence between, of people on different sides of the political divide in terms of what we should be prioritizing, right? But of course, they can't admit that, right? It's a lot of the responses to these editorials are like, see, even the New York Times is admitting we were right all along, but if you sort of peel back that rhetoric, right, that sort of polarized political rhetoric that's been really getting in the way of kind of sound decision-making, frankly, in this global crisis, right, you can actually see a convergence of views. And in this day and age, I find that like when people on different sides of the political divide agree on something, there's probably something there, right? Because we want to disagree, we want to disagree with our political opponents, right? We're always looking, if they say X, I say not X, right? So if there's sort of convergence of opinion, there may be something valuable to kind of look at there, which I think is, you're starting to see in COVID debates. Now I don't necessarily think that means everybody's becoming a critical thinker or embracing some of these ideas I've been sort of pushing, but it does show signs that like when the stakes are really, really high, people do sort of run to these toolkits. And it's interesting, when the book came out, I did a lot of interviews, and a lot of them were in sort of like political shows, because, left wing, right wing, because everybody, on all sides of the political spectrum love critical thinking. They embrace it. They think it's valuable, important. And so they're always asking, why do the people who disagree with me not do it? As opposed to my side, right? And I think if you sort of look through, I'd say Logic Check is not particularly picking, partisan arguments primarily, but in occasions where I do analyze arguments and they have a kind of left-right basis to them, you can sort of see that, the political identity actually has value, right? There are a set of values that come with picking a political identity, just the same way there are a set of values for having a religious identity, et cetera. And so those things don't have to get in the way of kind of thoughtful argumentation debate, which leads, of course, to the question, what is getting in the way of thoughtful argumentation debate? If one's political beliefs don't necessarily have to prevent people from engaging in dialogue, why do we refuse to engage in dialogue? And I guess I would say, it's a variety of factors, but a big one is we've just lost the ability to do so. We don't have the tools. We don't, these things you and I have been talking about for the last kind of 40, 45 minutes is not something that students are taught or taught enough or given the ability to practice and get good at, so that by the time they reach college or reach graduate school or their first job or even later in life, they're not sort of prepared to examine their own biases and see where those might be distorting judgment, dissect an argument to see what's really being said before jumping to conclusion or deciding, what something said, take that dissection and turn it into something you can apply logic or the critical thinker's toolkit to. So it's, it is all entangled together, but I don't want people listening to this to think this is a purely academic debate. I would say, our ability to get out of this mess we're in, as a society, as a global society, and not just COVID, our sort of political polarization and sort of gridlock ultimately boils down to bringing some of this ability back into the conversation.
Wow, you're really doing a great job here of actually leading into my questions. I want to give you a scenario that played out in my classroom and then see how you would deal with this in terms of critical thinking and evaluation. So I gave my students this semester a group project where I asked them to think about how we value information today. Specifically, I gave them 4 topics that I wanted them to come up with some kind of mechanism for how to organize this information. The 4 topics were, first, misinformation and disinformation. The second topic was confirmation bias. The third topic was how to deal with competing opinions. And the fourth topic was how do we deal with competing facts? Now, this last one, the competing facts one, was the one that was most interesting to them and also at times the most difficult one, because we tend to think of facts as something that stands on their own merit, right? You can't really push back against a fact. People say you're entitled to your opinions, your emotions, but you're not entitled to your facts. So when somebody puts a fact out there, they tend to stand behind it and feel quite good about their fact as an argument. Well, when we were talking about facts and competing facts, one of my students brought up a conversation that he listened to involving Joe Rogan and Sanjay Gupta, Dr. Sanjay Gupta. And what ended up happening was CNN came out and proclaimed that Joe Rogan had taken a horse dewormer to fight COVID. Now, the drug in question, and I can't really say the name of it because apparently if you say the name, they'll kick you off, YouTube or platforms, which is absolutely ridiculous. Let's just say it begins with IV and then just keeps going from there. So CNN came out and proclaimed Joe Rogan is taking a horse dewormer to fight COVID. Now, what we did is we put arguments aside for a second, and we wanted to just kind of look at that statement, that claim, and just kind of break down what it actually means here. Is there validity to the claim that he took a horse dewormer? All right. So, it is a fact that this particular drug is used as an anti-parasitic in animals, a horse being one of those animals. So on a purely surface level, trying to validate the claim, technically speaking, Joe Rogan or anybody who takes this particular drug has taken a horse dewormer. Sure, we can go with that, right? Okay. Now, in response to this, Joe Rogan came back and said, what I took was a Nobel Prize winning drug that won the Nobel Prize, I believe, for its anti-parasitic usage to treat and help cure river blindness in humans. Now, again, just on a surface level, looking at Rogan's claim back, is that factually correct? Yeah, actually, it did win the Nobel Prize, and it is used in humans to help treat river blindness, right? And it's actually considered a miraculous drug in that way. So what I did is I threw it out to my students. I said, okay, we've got one claim that we can validate. It is used in horse deworming, and we have another claim that says it is a Nobel Prize winning drug for humans. And I said, so what do we do when you have people throwing out these two facts against each other? And what do you make of this approach to discussion? And I'm so proud of them. They were able to put aside their own biases about wherever they stood on this issue. People tend to like to take stands on things, these days especially. And they just looked at it as a problem of conversation. And what they said was, they determined that both uses of this as kind of attacks ends up being problematic because it's not actually addressing the underlying argument that they think it's addressing, which is, does this particular drug help in the treatment of COVID-19?
Yeah, no, I commend you on sort of inspiring that exercise. I think it's really valuable. I think, but I would say it also kind of demonstrates, I mentioned before, journalists and fact checking, it often is very difficult to have a conversation and explain to a journalist that they're in fact in the argument business, right? Because they think of themselves as producers of facts that could be, verified as true or false, which of course they do, and most do very, very well. But if you read even a news article, anything other than yesterday's weather, right? There are facts in there, but those facts are built into arguments, right? Even the weather report, okay? Predicting tomorrow's weather says, based on these facts, current barometric pressure and where clouds are, I am going to argue that tomorrow is going to be sunny, right? That's a conclusion, right? So even in the simplest news stories, other than reporting yesterday's sports scores, which are or yesterday's weather, those are just facts, right? Almost everything else facts are built into an argument, right? So you do have to understand what the argument is. Also, I think there's been a disservice in sort of talking about facts and opinion because, and that goes back to like kindergarten, right? I do a lot of work with K-12, and you look at standards, there's a lot about separating facts from opinion, which is a very important skill, but it leads to this notion that there are two things in the world: facts that can be proven true or false, and anything that's not a fact is an opinion, or worse, just an opinion, right? But there's another thing in the universe, which is reasons for belief, reasons, right? It's called warrant in logical argumentation, right? So when you're arguing that, like, we've had lockdown in place for 6 months, let's say this is, the end of last year, we've had lockdown in place for 6 months, and COVID deaths are still going up. Obviously, mitigation methods aren't working, right? That's an invalid argument, okay? And I won't dissect why. Probably most listeners can instinctively disagree with it. Take my word for it. The reason you disagree with it, it's an invalid argument, right? But all the premises are true, right? Obviously, you can't argue 6 months after lockdown started that we've been in lockdown 6 months, and we all know deaths increased during that period, right? So there you have facts, okay? But the conclusion is not wrong, is not just an opinion, right? The conclusion is false, or at least the conclusion is something you don't need to accept. But why? The facts are all true, okay? Because there's something that connects the facts to the conclusion, reasons, okay? So this falls because of reasons. Now, getting back to your Joe Rogan argument, your students were arguing, it had a celebrity involved with it, or two celebrities, so obviously that colors things. But the basic argument is, is this drug effective at fighting COVID, right? Which is an argument, you could plug any drug into the premise of that argument, including the new vaccines, right? And in fact, I wrote on Logic Check about when Johnson & Johnson was pulled for a few weeks because people thought it did the job, but it had dangerous side effects, right? So even the things we take for granted, and we don't get pulled off the air for talking about them as COVID cures, right? Those are built into logical arguments that say, this drug works, and here's why, and here's my premises, and all those things are facts, that lead to a conclusion. Okay, so one can do that with other medications, right, including the unspeakable, IV one. Now, but I think there's something else going on here, right? And I talk about this also, why language skills, including rhetoric, persuasive communication is important because, by calling that drug a horse dewormer, right, that is a deliberate choice to ignore other ways you could describe it, right? You could describe it as a Nobel Prize winning parasite, eliminator. You could describe it as, but, if you want to make it seem like another quack remedy, and we all know there's been kind of ridiculous quack remedies out there. If you want to lump this in with quack remedies, you pick a use for it that will cast it in a bad light, even if that's not necessarily, doctors don't like, what you need is a horse dewormer, right? They're thinking what you need is an anti-parasitic, et cetera, et cetera. So I think there's a bit of people who want to get you to kind of think this is a quack remedy are going to pick language that will sort of push you in that direction, or at least embarrass you to support such a thing. Now, one can have a perfectly reasonable argument about why this drug is inappropriate for COVID, right? Without sort of declaring it a horse dewormer or whatever you want to do, right? Because you could do that probably with like many, I don't know enough about medicine to know, but like I imagine many medications that have multiple uses, you could find its most absurd use and say, why are you giving a heart patient a drug to treat diarrhea? Well, possibly because it's useful for both, on that. So I'd say probably you get a conversation like that going again. And I think bringing in sort of rhetoric and connotation, is there any way you could describe this drug other than, why did you choose a drug that has these various properties? Why did you choose that? Was it because that's the only possible way to describe it? Was it because you have you're trying to push people in one direction about thinking one way about this drug, so you'd rather refer to it as that as opposed to a Nobel Prize winning. And I think that could be a way to, if you get people to accept more generous or charitable terminology and still reject the conclusion, that's much more powerful, right? It's like if you win the argument and you construct the strongest version of your opponent's argument and you still defeat it, that's much more long lasting. That's much more persuasive. That's much more likely to persuade even somebody who's making an argument you disagree with, right? When you weaken that person's argument, either by coming up with a sort of, a watered down version or reinterpreting their premises, right? So I think that the phrase for this is steel manning versus straw manning, but in philosophy circles, it's called principle of charity. And the principle of charity, you don't do it just to be, unilaterally disarm. Okay, that's basically taking on the strongest version of an opponent's argument, presuming, if one of their premises can be interpreted in a way that would make it weaker than it was meant to be, like the horse dewormer thing. Don't do that. Instead, argue based on your opponent's definitions, construct his argument, and you can still attack it, but it's attack a stronger version. Why do that? Because think about if you presented an argument and somebody argued against an absurd version of it, right? You wouldn't be persuaded. You would hopefully see through the fact that somebody's not trying to take on your argument. They're trying to avoid it or distract from it. So I'd say that's, part of the sort of disposition of being a critical thinker. There's a number of them, as you kind of read about the book, but one of them is to be charitable, to be sort of charitable to other people's arguments, as well as being sort of rigorous in terms of taking them on.
Yeah, we were in the rhetoric unit for the semester, actually, when we looked at this exchange and talked about it. So my students had a bit of a scaffold from which they could pull from to be able to address this back and forth here, these exchanges of claims. I teach mostly first and second year college students in my class, and every so often when I tell somebody that I teach, a critical inquiry and writing course, they'll say, oh, that must be, difficult because, young people today, they just seem to be all over the place in terms of their thinking. But in actuality, they're quite sharp. And if you simply give them the opportunity to critically engage the world around them, they can do it quite well. But you have to give them the proper scaffold to be able to understand, like anyone else for thousands of years, right? Like, you have your biases. It's your job to acknowledge them and to try your best to push them aside enough to be able to evaluate a thought or an idea just on its own merit. But they're absolutely phenomenal. They did a wonderful job this semester of evaluating various forms of rhetoric and even in their critical analysis as well. Okay, so I want to ask you something, kind of a personal question about your own thinking habits here. As you talk about in the book a little bit, or at least you convey this in the book, critical thinking is never something that you stop learning about. We're always working on our critical thinking, and we're always trying to practice it and engage it so that we become stronger and whatnot. What is something about critical thinking that you struggle with personally?
Well, I think, there's one theory that critical thinking is one of those 10,000 hour skills, right? That to get really good, like being a champion athlete or virtuoso musician. So, as you probably know, even the person who coined that 10,000 hour didn't mean that like in 9,999, you're not, but like something magic happens. But it's clearly a skill that takes years to develop. And fortunately, you can practice thinking. And you don't need a sports equipment. You don't need an instrument, a quiet place. We do it all the time. We don't always do it critically. We don't always do it systematically, of course, but there's always opportunities to practice, when you're reading the news, when you're having a conversation, when you're having a debate or argument. So I would say, all of us are in a constant project to improve on these skills. I think, people who study this or practice, at least we know what it is we're working on. At least we have a set of tools. Like I mentioned before, I tend to think in terms of informal arguments, but other people in the community as I work in, they think in terms of argument maps and diagrams, but at least there's a tool set to work from. So I'd say, this is one of the reasons it's so important to give people this tool set early on. So as they practice on their own, they'll have the sort of tools to work with. I would say, one of the primary reasons to do this is it's a counter agent to these sort of confirmation biases and things that are hardwired into our brains that we can't eliminate, right? We're not going to turn into planet Vulcan, right? We are human beings with emotions and, certain ways that our brains work, and that's allowed us to survive and are often things of great value. All biases are not created equal. But I'd say I certainly struggle with, my biases like anybody else does, right? I think, I'm, a certain age, a certain gender, a certain religion. I grew up in a certain, community. I tend to think in certain ways, and that colors my perception, right? I mean, because of the work I've done, I'm sort of neither believe that all that is nonsense, right? And that every thought that comes into my head is immaculately conceived, right? I fully understand that my environment, my backgrounds, et cetera, inform, what I observe and how I deal with that. So, but at the same time, you can be, just as it's absurd to say, critical thinking makes you like immune to all that, it's equally absurd to say that's all we are. We're nothing but a collection of our biases and our preconceptions that derive from our age and our gender and our race and our background and et cetera, et cetera. So I'd say, like most people, I am kind of not necessarily struggling with this, but I stay aware of when I'm choosing to believe something. For example, am I believing it because it fits my worldview? Okay, and if that is the case, I don't automatically embrace it, 100% without thinking it further. But nor do I reject it because that's just something anybody of my age and race and would believe. Also, I critique it. I think about it. And in a way, that's like all any of us can do, right? We have things we believe, and most of the time those are legitimate. But even our legitimate beliefs are open to scrutiny, because if you could sort of argue with your own beliefs and you find a flaw in them, well, that can shore them up, right? That can potentially make your beliefs stronger by modifying them. You talked before about an argument that was made stronger by weakening the conclusion, right? Or qualifying the conclusion, right? One's own beliefs can be made stronger by being open to having them challenged, even by yourself, right? Or lo and behold, you might change your mind. And as we talked about before, like people are changing their minds about vital issues, like what's the best way to deal with the third year of COVID, right? That's not a sign of weakness, that's a sign of strength. And if we could sort of build that into ourselves individually, build that into our communities, into our society, then why would we have stupid fights because we can't accept we're wrong, especially since accepting we're wrong is not a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength and flexibility and power and the ability to think well and think critically. So I guess that's really what I'm sort of pushing in the books and the websites and all the curriculum work I do is how do we get ourselves to just sort of take this wiring we've been given. And it's pretty fantastic wiring, I mean, in terms of what humans have been able to achieve and can continue to achieve, right? How do we use what's good about it? How do we not throw away everything that gets us into trouble, but understand it, reflect on it, when need be, control for it, and that's the way we can move forward. Example I always like to use is science, right? Everyone's like, so science is not this like thing a certain special kind of person does, right? Science is not a single method, right? Science is a culture. And what does that culture does? It diminishes confirmation bias. Doesn't eliminate it, right? There's still bad science all the time that results from people embracing a theory they want to embrace for too long, et cetera, but it diminishes it just enough to give us all the marvels science has provided over the last 400 years, right? So if we can just diminish our biases, not completely eliminate, but just enough in other aspects of our lives, and how we make decisions, how we, make political choices, et cetera, could we achieve that same kind of bounty, but to solve all kinds of problems, including some of the problems science has caused?
Well, I think that's probably a good place to start drawing our conversation to a close here. And I think you're right that we need to be able to come to a place where we can have these difficult, complex discussions through critical thinking, right? Because our problems as a species, it's not as if they're going to become easier or less complex, which means I think our thinking and our discussions have to become more complex as well. And if you're adding complexity to a discussion, you have to be able to convey that information to each other as accurately as possible, and also in an engaging enough way that people feel like they can come and have a meaningful conversation with you. And then it's not just a one-sided, you're screaming at them, they're screaming at you, and no one gets anywhere in the actual discussion. So, Jonathan, this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. Please tell my listeners, where can they learn more about you and about your work?
Probably the best place to start is my own kind of professional website, which is my name, jonathanhaber.org, which has links to critical thinking and other books I've written on critical thinking and other topics. I mentioned Logic Check. I think logiccheck.net, that would be a place I recommend for people who want to see some of the things Joseph, you and I have been talking about in action. I also have a site called Degree of Freedom, that degreeoffreedom.org, all one word, that sort of includes things like a set of teaching practices. I call them high leverage critical thinking teaching practices, that shows how some of these ideas can be put to use in specific educational situations. So probably start there, but those will be on your show notes. People have links to those 3 sites.
This has been an absolutely wonderful time for me. Thank you, Jonathan, for being on the show.
It was a total pleasure, Joseph. Thanks for the invite, and hope we get a chance to talk again sometime.
Well, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jonathan Haber, and I encourage you to use the links in the show notes below to check out Jonathan Haber's work. Additionally, if you enjoyed the episode, please hit the subscribe and follow button and leave a kind rating and/or comment where applicable for the podcast. We want to make sure we get this information in front of as many people as possible. Until next time, try to keep one foot firmly planted on the neutral ground, and have a great day.